So today we're going to be presenting on Little Tokyo. We're going to be breaking it up into three sections. We're going to be going over the origins of Little Tokyo, and how it started and the pre-internment era, and then we're going to be going over what happened during the during the internment of the individuals who lived in Little Tokyo, and then after the internment era to the modern day. So the first part is the internment era. To get an understanding of of how this started, we needed to understand the climate of the United States at the time. So, the U.S. has always needed a big pool of cheap labor to fuel their industries, and typically they look outside of the United States to get this cheap labor. So, labor recruiters go to other countries and sell this idea of an American dream where individuals can have a house, a car, and become upwardly mobile in the economic section. But for a long time, they came to China. They came to China to recruit these immigrants to come to America, and these Chinese Americans ended up supporting a lot of our infrastructure around railroads, mining, and the agricultural industries. So really, it was a lot of our initial industries were built off Chinese American labor. However, the general American public were unhappy with their wages at the time, and they felt like the Chinese Americans were the reason why they were getting priced out and their wages were dropping. So they started doing racial scapegoating, and this ended up getting to the politicians, and eventually the Chinese Exclusion Act was signed in 1882 to make sure that Chinese American immigration slowed down and actually completely stopped. They banned Chinese laborers from coming to the United States and becoming naturalized citizens in the future. However, the need for labor didn't stop, and so these labor recruiters started looking to other countries, and the first country that they went to was actually Japan. So this caused a large influx of Japanese Americans coming to Los Angeles, looking to make their life in the New World and start living the quote-unquote American dream. However, there's a general pattern of when immigrants start coming to America, we see a lot of discrimination towards those immigrants. This is either through redlining or social discrimination. So in order to support each other, they ended up going into enclaves and creating a space where they can live together, supporting each other. So in 1885, Charles Hama opened a restaurant called Kame Restaurant, and at this point people started settling around it, but they thought this was temporary and that eventually they would find a better place to live. However, as more people came, people started opening businesses around the Kame Restaurant, and this actually just became the enclave of Little Tokyo today. So in 1906, San Francisco had a large earthquake, and Japanese American individuals weren't getting the support that they needed from the San Francisco government at the time. So they ended up coming to Los Angeles, and this caused the population to grow from 3,000 to 10,000. So businesses started booming in the area, new businesses started opening up, and Little Tokyo starts to look like what it is today. However, a year after this, anti-Japanese American sentiment was rising. Individuals felt like they were taking their jobs, as we always seen in this pattern, and the U.S. and Japan ended up having to sign a gentleman's agreement to stop cheap labor from coming from Japan. So Japanese individuals were denied work visas after this point. Um, However, the U.S. still, because this was a gentleman's agreement, the U.S. still allowed businesses and business people, students, and spouses that are to come to America, but not cheap labor. Um, so with these families coming over, um, individuals had their families to start like helping them open businesses and stuff. So we saw the commercial district thriving, especially with business people coming over and students who had degrees. Um, a lot of businesses started to thrive at this point, and with people's families coming over, they needed schools to support them and trade schools. So these were very important at the time, as a lot of the institutions at during this time didn't allow minorities to come to their schools, as a lot of segregation practices were common. So Japanese Americans were able to support their communities and make sure that their kids had a place to learn. And on top of that, they had a way to propagate their culture to the community through the schools. Religious institutions were also very important at the time, as Buddhist temples and Christian churches were a place for individuals to congregate and and organize as a community, and do community action that affected politics at the time. And a really important place was the Higashi Hagonji branch temple, which was the first Buddhist temple in America, um, where the Japanese individuals were able to like maintain their nostalgic culture from home, as well as throw festivals that reminded them of the place that they came from. Another very important thing that happened at this time was the credit associations opening up. So, uh, so immigrants and minorities for a long time have struggled to get loans from classical banks due to discrimination and seeing them as more risky due to them being immigrants. So they really struggled to open businesses. However, um, we've seen a lot of trends of these enclaves opening up their own credit associations to help the people in the community, um, yeah, open businesses. And of course, community development and mutual aid societies were also to help those who were downtrodden in the Little Tokyo at the time. So with that, we're getting towards the internment era.
All right, so I'm going to be talking about the internment camps and what led to Bronzeville. So before World War II, as Max previously talked about, there was a huge Japanese community in the US, and the largest community was in Little Tokyo. There was a large anti-Japanese sentiment due to the large increase in Japanese immigration and white Europeans feeling threatened. There were thriving businesses, schools, and residents. So what caused the internment camps was World War II and the reactions to it. So in 1941, Pearl Harbor was bombed, and this caused a fear of Japanese Americans. Already existing racism against Japanese Americans was fueled by Pearl Harbor, and many Americans demanded them to be removed. European Americans were threatened by the growing population of Japanese Americans due to competition for land and jobs. So this just made the bombing of Pearl Harbor made them want to remove them completely. So the executive order is what caused the internment camps. So on February 19th, 1942, FDR issued Executive Order 9066. This forced 120,000 Japanese Americans into World War II internment camps. Regardless if they were American citizens or not, Japanese Americans were placed in these camps. So the camp conditions were pretty awful. It was very cramped living. unsanitary conditions, disease and illness outbreaks, lack of nurses and doctors, and all this obviously led to, unfortunately, many people died in these camps, and there were even armed guards posted outside the camps. So the end of internment. They were allowed to return on January 2nd, 1945. All they were given when they left was $25 and a bus ticket. Due to being in these camps for years, many had lost their homes, businesses, jobs, and even loved ones. Upon their return, they encountered hostility, racism, and violence. So, with all the Japanese people being out of Little Tokyo, it was this huge open hub for people to move into. And this is what created Broadville. So LA forced a labor shortage due to World War II, in which thousands of African Americans came over to fill wartime jobs. This allowed spaces for African Americans to move into. Thus, Little Tokyo was turned into Bronzeville. It included hotels, restaurants, stores, etc. Most notably, the Finale Club, which was like a pilgrimage site to jazz players at the time. But although all this, it was only able to last for 3 years. So jobs and wartime operations became scarce after the war ended, and Japanese people returned to Little Tokyo in order to reestablish their community. So residents of Bronzeville left to find jobs in other parts of America. Many returning Japanese Americans bought out business leases from Bronzeville people.
Okay, so I will be talking about little post-World War II of Little Tokyo and modern day Little Tokyo. Okay, so for the economy of post-World War II in Little Tokyo, a lot of the desired jobs were less likely to be available, so people had to take on jobs that were undesired, quote unquote, to provide for their family. And although some Japanese Americans sought careers outside of their community, Little Tokyo would remain to be their area of origin. So they supported businesses by purchasing things such as produce and other necessities and visiting their enclave often rather than going to other corporate businesses. And they would also attend church services and enroll their children in language schools to stay grounded to their root. And Hillary Jenks states that Japanese Americans would visit Little Tokyo about 2 to 3 times a month to participate in community activities and visiting family members. And in 1963, the Little Tokyo Redevelopment Association was instituted by property owners, businessmen, and investors. And this association was formed to combat rising threats made by the surrounding regions of Little Tokyo, such as the Civic Center or Bunker Hill, in hopes to maintain their land. And for the culture of post-World War II, many of the residents in Little Tokyo began to feel like foreigners in their own territory. So Japanese Americans had to adjust to a cultural change, such as from like gentrification in Little Tokyo, since this was always a place to express their cultures and traditions. And although Japanese Americans recognize the importance of Little Tokyo, the current culture of the enclave is not what it once was. So cultural identity of Japanese Americans back then it consisted of modesty and low-wage jobs, but now newer generations of Japanese Americans have adapted more to American customs and traditions and values. And the differences within Japanese culture, there was a class and social status was often caused by the divide between the Japanese Americans and the native Japanese. So Japanese businessmen and tourists who were visiting Little Tokyo from Japan referred to the Japanese Americans in the region as trash that had to leave Japan. So for the Japanese American contributions, Japanese Americans kept their authenticity in Little Tokyo by engaging heavily in their community, despite the belief that it would be abandoned after World War II. So they worked in shops and markets located in Little Tokyo rather than looking for jobs outside the enclave, although they were receiving lower wages in these shops. And additionally, they built establishments such as churches and language schools to invest their money and emotion into Little Tokyo to keep their ethnic background. And this led to the preservation of Little Tokyo. So the growth of the downtown civic center posed a threat to Little Tokyo because its need for more land, just more land in general. But however, business owners and people of the community of Little Tokyo preserved their land by remaining loyal to their enclave. And in 1998, Ties That Bind produced the Declaration for Nikkei Community. And this declaration was created to support and mentor Japanese American youth, making sure they don't lose their Japanese identity. So Little Tokyo present day. In 2005, a mural was unveiled in the enclave to show the culture and to build a sense of community. It was created and placed on the corner of East First Street and Central Avenue, which is located in Little Tokyo, to maintain its origin and remind the visitors of its history and culture. And the data collected in the early 2000s shows that Japanese Americans of mixed race accounted for 31% of the Japanese population. So Japanese Americans are more likely now than pre-World War II era to marry outside of Japanese race, which leads to a higher biracial Japanese families.
Awesome. Those are your references, and thank you. Yeah.